my brothers and sisters, my siblings in Christ, thank you for this opportunity to be with you today, especially on this first Monday of Advent. I want to invite you to think of Advent in some ways maybe you've not thought of, or maybe you have. And I begin not with a word of Scripture, but with the words of William Bridges. So if you're a pastor or you're a leader, you're a community organizer, you're going to need William Bridges sooner or later. William Bridges talks about when institutions or groups or families or people, something ends in your life, and you're ready to start that new thing. Before you can go from the last thing to the new thing, there's just something in the middle. Transitions is the name of his resource. And I call transitions as the same thing as Advent. It's that liminal space between what was and what's about to happen. And it's an invitation to each of us. Before I begin, I want to express some gratitude. And so, first of all, I want to say to Dr. Corey Walker, what a blessing he's been to me. We've just met recently, and he's given me much to think about when I think about the possibility that we're not Christian yet. We're on our way. And when you think that way, it gives you room for yourself, and especially those you have hard conversations with, to keep loving each other. It's a journey. Being Christian and doing Christian, we're on our way. The other expression of gratitude I want to give to my colleague that's with me today, the Rev Dr. Craig Atwood, who taught here for a long season. And one of the reasons I want to thank him is the fall semester of 2001, guess what happened? September 11th. We all started an Advent we did not want. Before that actually happened, though, the semester began, and Craig was here as a professor, and he had just left Salem College, so they had to figure out what they were going to do. Unknown to them, I was in an unwanted Advent season between churches, not sure if I wanted to stay in ministry or not. And Craig reached out and said, hey, could you just hold down the classes I teach at Salem for this semester, maybe the spring semester, till they sort out what they want to do. Sort of the bullpen pitcher who comes in not to lose the game or save the game, just don't wreck the game. And you saved my life. Because I learned to be a teacher and then a pastor. And I learned to be a preacher because if you're going to teach Intro to New Testament, guess what? And over and over and over, you become a better student of it. So thank you, Craig. I also want to, and I got to do that for 5 years, so that Advent season was really, really long. But I re-entered ministry at the end of that spring semester as a pastor. So I've been doing both ever since. I also want to thank the first cohort of graduates from this fine institution of Wake Divinity School. I got to be one of those pastors where somebody was, we call it field ed or vocational training, and Peggy Matthews, who could teach me, was the student, and we learned a lot from Peggy on our staff. And then 10 years later, I came to know Jenny Hemrick, who was a graduate of that class, and she's probably my closest pastoral friend because she challenges me. She calls me out on my stuff. And every one of you, as you proceed in ministry, whatever form it takes, you need a colleague that can do that. So I want to thank that first cohort that continues to bless my life. My whole point is this. Wake Divinity School is a gift to me. It is to this community and to the world. And you are an extension of that gift. So let's talk about Advent. Yes, it's the last chapel of the year, but it's the beginning of this Advent season, and I want you to know this is my favorite season, partly because I was born on the eve of Advent 60 years ago, just had that birthday. Been a parish pastor for 32 years, most of that time, 20 of those years, not in Winston-Salem, but in, I call it the hinterland, where people want to know what a Moravian is. One time we had a church bus and they misspelled the wording on the side, and it said more veins. And nobody knew the difference. They just thought we were. And so I was formed by, we're Christians, and there's a wonderful story here, and being prepared to tell that story, but more importantly, to listen to the person who's asking the question. So that's formed me a lot. I also noticed as a young pastor, particularly in Catawba County, that even though people think we're weird because you're not some standard Protestant tradition that they're already aware of, we do have Moravian stars and sugar cake and something called Love Feast. And I noticed they would be way more curious and interested in considering the walk with Jesus during Advent than any other season of the year. So I wanted to take advantage of that. And I was paying attention to how Advent can make or open the door for people to be curious. I think Advent's grossly misunderstood because we try to make it too complicated, and we're not comfortable with it being just simple. It's a candle. It's a journey. It's 4 weeks. It's mostly just watching and waiting. One of those first years, I was in Hickory, and I was in a lectionary group, and one of my colleagues, my wife is expecting our second son, who was born in February. His wife was expecting their first son that might come at Christmas, and guess what? He did during the Christmas Eve service. And we were joking about this time, maybe late November. Okay, so let me get this right. He's trying to imagine Joseph going home to talk to Mary. Now, listen, I got some good news and some bad news. The bad news is we got to pay the taxes. And the good news is we can do that, but we're going to have to get on a donkey and ride about 90 miles from here up into West Jefferson. It's about similar topography, similar distance. And he said, if I told Erin to do that at 8 months pregnant, if I went home today and said that, I'm not sure I would live the rest of the day. And then it happened. She gave, anyway, you get my point. This is an invitation to wonder and curiosity, and especially the narratives of Luke and Matthew, is an invitation to ponder the ongoing liminal spaces in our lives, especially the ones we share in common. It's the between the ending of the old and the beginning of the new. But I want to make it clear, I think it's misinterpreted when we make fear the message about belief, and we try to scare faith into people, which is how often the gospel lessons during this season can be interpreted. They could be an opportunity. I like Advent because it invites me to watch and wait for what God is up to right now. Where does that come from? So in 1983, I started that journey at Mars Hill, and at the time I was the only Moravian. There was one Quaker, a couple Methodist, everybody else was Baptist. I'm not sure a Christian Baptist, just Baptist. It was kind of like an identity. And Baptists were fighting over inerrancy and fundamentalism in a harsh way. Bill Leonard can tell you more about that. So what that meant was, unknown to us, the great professors you would have at a seminary were teaching at the undergraduate level. And Mars Hill had 2 phenomenal professors. One of them was the Rev Dr. Tom Sawyer. Yeah, that's his actual name. And he taught New Testament and he taught Greek. And his philosophy was, if we teach you Greek, you can read the Bible for yourself. Ever since then, when I've had a church member get mad about some new translation, I'll say, I'm going to pick on Craig. Craig, can you read Greek? And they always say no. I said, well, until you can read Greek, you're always reading somebody's translation. And the test was, and this was an Advent in my life that lasted for 2 years. It took 4 semesters. In that 4th semester, you had to translate 1 John. And I remember coming to what you just heard, the 4th chapter, around about the 10th verse, and having my life turned upside down in a beautiful way. There's another story for another time, but I have become fond of the First Nations version of the New Testament. And I use it as a test case to see how well stuff's translated. And the reason that Tom Sawyer wanted us to really dig into 1 John 4, long about verse 10, is there's a mystery word there. It only appears one time in the New Testament, hilasmos. And it is not about substitutionary penal atonement. It's what God did to love us. So here's a different translation. And I'm going to begin at verse 7. My much loved friends, agape each other. That's my addition, love, but it means agape love. Agape love comes from the great Spirit, and all who agape love, unconditionally love, have been born of him and know him. And those who do not unconditionally love, agape love, do not know him. For the great Spirit is agape love, unconditional love. Creator showed his agape love for us by sending the only Son who fully represents him into this world so that we could live through him. This is agape love, not that we agape loved the Creator, but that the Creator loved us and proved his love by sending his Son to take on himself the burdens of our broken ways. It doesn't explain how it happened, but it does explain the outcome. Here's the best part. This is the part that shook me. My much loved friends, if Creator loved us like that, then we should also love each other. For no one has ever seen God or the great Spirit, but as long as we love unconditionally each other, he remains in us and his love is made complete in us. And what Tom Sawyer said is, actually, what that text is implying is sort of an irony. You haven't seen God. Well, what do people see when we love each other unconditionally? What do people see when they see Christians not walking around telling people what's wrong with them, but they see us walking around loving each other, Christian to Christian, unconditionally? What do they start to see? God. So it's sort of a promise. God's not saying God can be seen. It all happens around our ability to love unconditionally. So you got these 4 candles, and different traditions will say different, they'll say them in different orders. Peace is always the third one, by the way. They might say love, hope, peace, and then the 4th one's always joy. See how these themes help the communities grapple with things over time. I was thinking about COVID, another season of Advent that lasted way too long. And that first Christmas when some of us were still shuttered in place, trying to figure out how Moravians are going to actually pull off a love feast. How are you going to feed people when we're really not supposed to be in each other's presence? And it made, at least in my case, a bunch of us strip away the trappings of our traditions to hear that first word, love feast. How can we do that? And when we started actually trying to figure out how to feed the neighborhood instead of a service, and then service became to feed the neighborhood, and all of a sudden we were learning all over again what our tradition had been trying to teach us in the first place. That Greek class at Mars Hill lasted, as I said, for 2 years. It was a long Advent season because there was discovery. There was letting go of ways I used to see things. There was a rediscovery, a reconstruction of a new way of seeing and doing around agape. 1 John 4:12 became my watchword, not just for that moment in time, but I think ever since. And now in the role that I play, I find myself fascinated about trying to make agape-ing a verb. How do we agape love into each other? How do I let somebody agape me, particularly if I'm kind of mad and pissed off at them or they've disappointed me? But when we do, there's that promise again. God's presence shows up. In Moravian Roots, we talk about this wonderful thing, and it goes back a long time ago. One of our mutual colleagues, Riddick Weber, who's my oldest friend outside of my family, we met at 5. Riddick now teaches at our seminary. And he says, Neil, you got to be careful when you go around talking this mess, because anybody that's older than you doesn't know what you're saying that's Moravian. Because up until the time of Craig Atwood and Riddick Weber and scholars like them, we didn't really have access in English to our Czech history. There was just a barrier to it. But I remember being so frustrated in my last year of seminary. I went to the dean at the time, who was a historian like Craig, and I said, I want to know what the ancient brethren believed. I'm talking way back, before the renewal. And so it was hard because there wasn't a lot of English sources, but I studied to understand what the essentials are and how they talked about these things. And I was fascinated to find out that even back in the 1450s, 60s, 70s, into the 1500s, or really the middle of the 1500s, the way Moravians lived this out is you lived in a small group. I mean, you did your work and you cared for stuff, but you had this group to fall back on every day. And you came to that group, and usually there's some kind of short scripture to guide the day. And if you were fortunate at the end of the day, you might circle back together, particularly if it was your literal work group. How did we see God in our work today? You see the connection of 1 John 4:12. Also learned that when Moravians had their big renewal in the 1727, and that community of Herrnhut was about to blow each other up with how much division they had over doctrine, that one way that they were trying to get through it was they studied 1 John that summer. And I'll contend the revival didn't come because they learned something. They just got to the end of themselves and they gave up and let go. And then the Spirit somehow showed up in their frustration and showed up in their willingness to love each other despite their differences. And they personified 1 John 4:12. Anyway, in that early time, we would say, God has saved you completely. You don't have anything to do with it. It's already happened. God's gift is free. But you do have a responsibility. You are called to respond with faith, love, and hope as best you can every day. We're going to be really imperfect at it. But check this out. If I'm not trying to do that lifting by myself, and I've got a couple people, and it's one of the reasons I brought Craig today, and Martha Albertson's here too, another friend, because they've done this in my life. I'm telling you, you need to find those people. In fact, I think you already are if seminary's working really well for you. Lean into those relationships. Anyway, the more we lean into them, the more we try to do faith, hope, love, and as best we can, it's not about the outcome if we got it right. It's what God is doing to reveal God's self through what you're doing, even your frustration. So suddenly, the season of Advent is really important. It's a deeper metaphor. The greatest Advent season, or I should say, the darkest Advent season in our modern times for the Moravian Church was just after World War II. There was a certain bishop who resided in the British province. His name was Clarence Shaw. He served like I do on a provincial elders board, and each president that's in an area, we have 25 areas in the world, share something called the Unity Board. It's not really a board of directors, it's just presidents talking to each other about the care of the worldwide Moravian Church. He had that role too. But imagine there's Germans who fought for the Third Reich, Moravian Germans who fought for the Third Reich, Moravian Germans who fought against the Third Reich. Imagine being that guy. Imagine, he was around the same time as George Bell in the beginning of the World Council of Churches and other British leaders and people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But anyway, the war's over. It takes a while for all that reconstruction to take place. And it wouldn't be till 1957 that the Moravians finally had a unity synod. Probably, we do this every 7 years, and it's probably because 1950 they just weren't ready or they financially couldn't pull it off. And they don't usually do them unless everybody can come. And it was going to take place in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and also be our 500th anniversary as a Protestant denomination. Now, Bishop Shaw had been going around doing kind of stump speeches to get people to come and to focus again on faith, hope, love, and not these political differences. He wasn't denying the differences. He was trying to get people to love through the differences and do something about it. And so somebody said, you ought to put that all together. He had done enough of it that he did. And there's 7 speeches, and they make it into something called the Spirit of the Moravian Church. And I'm using it now as best I can to remind the people I'm a part of who we are. There's 4 of those themes, just like Advent, I want to offer to you today. They're really modalities or a way to look back at ourselves in the mirror to say, not that we're getting it right, but we're on the right path. The first one, he said, is simplicity. Don't make this complicated. In fact, if somebody's doing the good work, cool, bless them. Go to where nobody's doing the work, where it's hard. And he said, if you look across Moravian history, those 500 years, and even in 1957, if you could travel the Moravian world, you'll see wherever community is, there's usually some expression of simplicity. That's why when Moravians do Christmas Eve especially, it's mainly the candles and eating and singing. It's simple. The second one he said, and this is really interesting, is happiness. And I hold this up aloft because the Wake Div students that I know that have become my partners in life, in my ministry, have shown me more than I've shown them, I think, about this. What is happiness? When you see Jesus on the cross, does this convict you of your sins? It should. What Moravians would talk about, and Bishop Shaw would say, but it should also drive you to happiness because we are free. We are forgiven. And that forgiveness doesn't make much of a difference unless you live it. And you choose to live it with people who are still stuck in that brokenness that Jesus is trying to take away from us. It's an active thing. We keep agapeing. We keep living into forgiveness. We keep living into reconciliation. The third thing he said, which he invented this word, is unintrusiveness. So let me explain this a little bit. So if it's Saturday morning, you got some stuff going on where you live, and somebody knocks at your door, and you open the door, and they look like I look right now, and they want to talk to you about Jesus, the chances are you're going to say, I've got way more to do, and this is not the time. They're being obtrusive, right? If you're studying for an exam, don't want to give any more anxiety than you may already have, and you have too many thoughts in your head at one time, that's called intrusive. You can't think straight. And he put the two words together for some crazy reason. So I reached out to my British friends to say, please explain what this means in your world. They said, keep it simple. Don't get in the way. The way you love people and show up for people ought to just be for whatever's needed, not for your recognition or whatever. Just love. And finally, fellowship, which takes me back to Dr. Sawyer, who explained very well the love we call koinonia, and that's what he really means. And in German, there's an exact word for that, Gemeinschaft. In English, there's no word for that, and fellowship's about as close as we get, and it's not enough. That where Christians gather, and he was talking about Moravians, there's this bond that they have. And I enjoy the fact that my parents weren't Moravians till they moved to Winston-Salem. This is the only tradition I've known. But I've had to be a Moravian mostly where I'm the only one. And I like that. Because I'm always looking and waiting for what God can teach me through the lives of other people. I feel like my basket gets fuller and fuller. I invited Martha to come because I like to say, Martha's the person I want to be when I grow up. Because she keeps finding these phenomenal ways to do both and, and whatever you do. You don't have to be a Baptist or a Moravian or whatever. You can be both and. But most importantly, there's an invitation to this Advent season right now. There's a world outside that's saying, so what? So what? There's an Advent. My life hurts too much. Well, I sat on our trustee board, and I didn't tell Craig this earlier. I was getting ready to tell you this. I was talking to one of our students that you know, and it was the day after the election, and I'm going to be honest, I was very disappointed, but that didn't matter. I wanted to know what she was thinking. And so we were trying to figure out how all that sorted out, and she invited me to think through the eyes of somebody who rents their home, be it an apartment or house, somebody who doesn't have things tied down, and no matter how good the economy seems to be, it's terrible for too many. So we began to think about what we could do about that, what I could do about that with pastors who may be called to this area. And I heard in her honesty a courage. Advent calls you to courage, to be more than you've been before, but not you, the group that you connect with, the group that God's calling into this moment, maybe for this particular season of Advent, like God did for me in that Greek class at Mars Hill that actually lasted for 2 years. Like God did for me when I had the opportunity to teach at Salem for 6 years. Like God has always done every time there's an Advent season. We're in a new one. How will you listen?